I was wiping down a wrench I had no engine left to use it on, an old habit from 30 years of handing my husband tools in a cold garage, when my grandson called to tell me I wouldn't be needed at the Concours Awards dinner, honoring the car his grandfather had spent 3 decades restoring. I remember setting the wrench down slowly, a faint smear of old grease still on my hand, right before his explanation rearranged the entire shape of that phone call. I had no idea that within the same conversation, I would also learn that his wife's growing social media following described the car as a barn, find they'd personally rescued and rebuilt together, with no mention of the man who'd actually spent 30 years bringing it back to life, and that within the following week, I would send a single formal letter through my attorney revoking the loan agreement that had let them use that car at all. My name is Rosalind Thorne. I'm 75 years old. I spent 40 years teaching high school English, and 30 of those years married to a man who spent nearly every weekend evening in our garage. The kind of patient, unglamorous work that teaches you a restoration isn't measured in dramatic before and after photographs, but in 10,000 small, unglamorous decisions nobody ever sees. My husband Emmett died 5 years ago, a fall from a ladder while reaching for a part on a high shelf in that very garage, the kind of ordinary Saturday afternoon that gave no warning at all. I remember hearing the crash from the kitchen and running out to find him on the concrete floor, his reading glasses still somehow perched on his nose. Grief that arrives in the middle of a small, ordinary task teaches you something particular. It teaches you that the smell of motor oil and old leather can undo you completely for years afterward, and that you learn, slowly, to keep walking into that garage anyway, because the alternative is letting the silence claim every bolt he ever tightened. Emmett and I built our life together slowly, the unglamorous way most honest things get built. He worked as an aircraft mechanic for the regional airport for nearly 35 years, meticulous with every inspection, the kind of man who double-checked a torque spec 3 times simply because he understood exactly what happened when someone skipped that third check. When I told him, 4 years into our marriage, that I wanted to finish my own teaching certification rather than stay comfortable substituting part-time, he didn't tell me it would be difficult with 2 small children at home. He told me he'd handle every school pickup and every dinner on my longest evening classes, and he did for years without complaints. Without. I built my own career slowly after that, the way most honest expertise gets built, one carefully taught lesson at a time, 40 years in the classroom until I finally retired with more patience than I sometimes believed I had any right to feel. I remember one particular struggling student early in my career, a boy convinced he'd never develop any real feel for writing, whom I spent an entire semester quietly encouraging after school, never once mentioning to the department how much extra time it actually required. He went on to become a respected local journalist, and years later, a letter arrived thanking me for refusing to let him give up on his own voice. I think about that letter often now in a different light than I once did, understanding that quiet, uncredited mentorship had always been the actual substance of my working life, long before anyone in my own family learned to take my own judgment for granted. Emmett didn't live to see the car reach the show circuit's current attention. He died 5 years before Callum ever asked to display it, and some evenings I still catch myself wanting to show him a particularly well-earned trophy before remembering there's no one on the other end of that particular conversation anymore. I have 2 children. Deborah, my daughter, is a hospital administrator, 3 time zones away, sharp and organized in exactly the way you'd hope an administrator's judgment would be. She calls every Sunday evening, without fail, a habit that started the year Emmett died and never once lapsed since. My son Whitfield passed away 8 years ago, before Emmett, leaving behind my grandson Callum, 34, a marketing coordinator, married for 4 years to a woman named Briar Holt, 31, whose growing social media presence around the classic car scene he has supported personally since they met, and who has always had a particular gift for making an inherited legacy sound like a personal adventure. Breyer grew up in a family that valued a compelling personal story above almost everything else, the kind of household where the actual sequence of events mattered less than how impressively that sequence could eventually be reframed. I don't say that to excuse what eventually happened. I say it because understanding where someone's hunger for a good narrative comes from doesn't mean you're obligated to keep feeding that hunger forever, especially once feeding it starts costing you your own husband's 30 years of patient labor. She told me a story once, early in her relationship with Callum, back when we still spoke easily and often, about her own father's small furniture flipping business. How he used to describe every piece he'd bought at a modest estate sale as a dramatic rescue from a dumpster, since customers paid considerably more for a compelling story than an honest one. My dad always said the story was the actual product, she told me. I grew up believing that a good narrative mattered more than an accurate one, and that admitting something had simply been inherited or purchased normally made it sound less impressive. I remember thinking at the time that it was a sad philosophy, worthy of real compassion. I didn't yet understand that she had built an entire public identity around controlling every narrative she touched, and that I would eventually become the inconvenient actual history that particular control required minimizing. Emmett bought that car, a badly deteriorated 1965 coupe, at an estate auction the year we married, paying almost nothing for it because everyone else in the room considered it beyond saving. He spent the next 30 years bringing it back one careful decision at a time, sourcing period-correct parts from salvage yards across 3 states, rebuilding the engine twice when the first attempt didn't meet his own standards, hand-stitching the interior himself after deciding no professional upholsterer nearby could match the original stitch pattern closely enough. It found modest, genuine recognition over the decades, several regional concours placements, a small but respected reputation among serious collectors who understood exactly what that level of restoration actually required. After Emmett died, that car became something closer to sacred to me, the clearest remaining trace of 30 years of patient devotion, since I had spent nearly every one of those Saturday evenings sitting on an overturned bucket in that garage, handing him tools and listening to him think out loud. When Callum came to me 2 years ago, describing his own growing interest in the classic car show circuit and asking whether he might display and drive the car at regional events, I was genuinely moved, thrilled to think of Emmett's 30 years finally reaching a wider audience of people who could actually appreciate what had gone into it. I did insist, however, on a proper loan agreement, drafted formally with my attorney rather than simply handed over on a handshake between grandmother and grandson. Callum would receive the right to display and drive the car at approved events, while I retained full legal title in exchange for accurately crediting Emmett's actual 30-year restoration in all show placards, media, and public statements. At the time, that condition felt like nothing more than sensible protection for a lifetime of patient work. It would take 2 years of careful, creeping erasure before I understood exactly what that condition was actually protecting. Before signing anything, I met with my attorney, a sharp, longtime family friend named Marguerite Aldis, who had helped Emmett and me handle the car's insurance and title work for decades. Loaning out a restoration like this is trickier than people assume, she told me. The car's story has real value independent of the vehicle itself, and that value depends entirely on the narrative people believe about where it actually came from. Protect the story as carefully as you protect the title. I thanked her and left her office determined to follow that advice completely. Callum signed the agreement himself at Marguerite's small conference table, reading every page carefully before asking, almost shyly, if he could look through Emmett's actual restoration logbooks one more time before committing to showing the car publicly. I spent that entire afternoon with him, walking through 3 decades of handwritten notes, watching him genuinely absorb the scope of what he was about to represent. I want you to actually understand what this protects, I told him. Not just the car, the whole story behind it. He promised he understood completely, and I believed him, having no reason at the time to imagine that promise wouldn't eventually be tested by his own wife's growing ambitions. I remember Callum's very first show appearance with the car vividly, standing near the display, watching longtime collectors who remembered Emmett genuinely moved, seeing the restoration still gleaming exactly as carefully as it had decades earlier, several of them shaking my hand before they'd even properly greeted Callum himself. Callum began showing the car 2 years ago to genuine early success, drawing real attention at regional events for its exceptional restoration quality. For the first several months, everything felt like exactly what I'd hoped it would be. Emmett's name properly credited on every show placard, Callum speaking warmly in early interviews about his grandfather's decades of patient work. The first time I noticed the story beginning to shift was during a regional car enthusiast magazine profile 10 months in, a glossy piece with professional photography of the car's gleaming paintwork, when Breyer, who had taken over managing Callum's growing social media presence entirely by then, described the car as a barn find they'd personally discovered and lovingly restored together, framing the entire 30-year restoration as their own recent project, without ever mentioning that Emmett had done every bit of that work himself, decades before Breyer ever entered the family. I read that article twice at my own kitchen table, searching for even a passing acknowledgement of Emmett's actual labor, and found none. The second incident happened at a small car club gathering, when a genuinely curious enthusiast, meeting me for the first time, complimented the restoration's remarkable period accuracy, asking how Callum had managed to source such exact original components. Breyer answered before Callum could, describing months of her own research and sourcing work, as though the actual decades of patient hunting through salvage yards had been her own recent accomplishment rather than Emmett's lifetime project. I corrected the record gently that time, mentioning simply that my late husband had done every bit of that sourcing himself over 30 years. Breyer laughed it off smoothly, telling the enthusiast that I was being modest on Callum's behalf, and the conversation moved on before I could clarify further. The third incident happened on Breyer's own social media account, a beautifully produced video of the car driving through a scenic back road, the caption describing their journey discovering a forgotten barn find and bringing it back to life together as a couple. My name and Emmett's appeared nowhere in that caption, nor did any mention of the car's actual 30-year restoration history. The post received thousands of admiring comments about Callum and Breyer's restoration skills. I read those comments more than once, searching for even a passing acknowledgement, and found none. The fourth incident happened when Breyer began describing the restoration, in interviews for automotive enthusiast publications, as a project she and Callum had undertaken together in their own garage, drawing loosely on family history rather than acknowledging a fully completed, decades-old restoration they had simply inherited use of. I mentioned to Callum gently that I found the growing distance from the car's actual origin increasingly uncomfortable. He told me Breyer simply had a flair for building an engaging personal brand, and that surely it didn't really matter exactly how she framed a detail that small. The fifth incident happened during a planning conversation for an upcoming regional concours event, sitting around Callum and Breyer's kitchen table with an entry form spread between us, when Breyer mentioned, almost as an aside, that she thought it might be cleaner for the event's own narrative if the entry description focused entirely on their own discovery and restoration journey, rather than getting into the loan agreement specifics, since judges and audiences responded better to a clean personal story. "Rosalind, you understand, right?" she said, glancing at me with a practiced, reasonable smile. "It's not about hiding anything. It's just easier at this point." I sat there listening to my grandson's wife discuss minimizing my documented ownership and Emmett's actual restoration as a matter of event strategy, as though 30 years of patient work were an inconvenient footnote rather than the very foundation the car's entire reputation depended on. The sixth incident happened when Breyer's own mother, meeting me for the first time at a holiday gathering, mentioned how proud she was watching her daughter and son-in-law build something so impressive entirely through their own restoration vision and hard work. "They've always had that gift," she said, beaming, "for finding something forgotten and turning it into something extraordinary." I said nothing to correct her, the same way I'd said nothing to correct anyone else. though I remember driving home afterward feeling the particular loneliness of being the only person in an entire extended family who actually knew the truth of a story everyone else believed completely. The seventh incident is the one I think about most because it's the one where I should have said something and didn't. It happened when the car was selected for a feature at a significant regional concours event, and the event's own promotional materials described the vehicle entirely as a recent barn find restoration by a young couple passionate about classic automobiles, with no mention of the car's actual 30-year history at all. I saw the printed concours program weeks later, my husband's entire life's work reduced to a single generic phrase, a remarkable recent restoration by two rising enthusiasts. The eighth incident happened at a small regional car club award dinner, where Callum and Breyer's social media presence was nominated for a Rising Enthusiast Recognition Award. Breyer accepted the smaller award that evening, giving brief remarks about the incredible journey of tracking down a nearly forgotten vehicle nobody else had properly appreciated, gesturing at projected images of the car as though the years of patient restoration behind it had simply been a lucky accident she'd stumbled into. I applauded along with everyone else, understanding, with a clarity that had been building for 2 years by that point, exactly how completely the record had been rewritten and exactly how comfortable everyone around me had become with that rewritten version. I didn't understand yet that splinters left alone don't disappear. They work their way deeper. I want to tell you that I confronted this early, that I was the kind of woman who draws a firm line the moment she's disrespected. I wasn't. I told myself 100 different stories to avoid dealing with the truth. Breyer is just building her own social media presence the way people do now. Callum loves me even if he doesn't correct her in the moment. The car is finally getting the attention Emmett always hoped it would, and that should be enough. I believed every one of those stories, some days more than others, because believing them was easier than accepting that my husband's 30 years of patient labor had become an inconvenient detail in someone else's more compelling barn find story. There was one afternoon, about 2 months before everything finally came to a head, when I came close to saying something. Breyer called to ask whether I'd be comfortable if a magazine profile simply described the restoration as a family project without getting into specifics about who actually did the work over which decades, since she felt the vaguer phrasing made for a cleaner narrative arc in the piece. I sat with the phone in my hand afterward, feeling something rise up in me that felt very close to the surface, very close to finally saying out loud everything I'd swallowed for nearly 2 years. Then I thought about Callum's happiness, about how much this hobby had already come to mean to him after losing his own father so young, about how a fight over credit would only ever complicate something he loved. I agreed to the vague phrasing and told myself one more time that the moment to say something hadn't quite arrived yet. Looking back, I understand now that I was wrong about that. The moment had arrived long before. I simply hadn't been ready to stand inside it yet. Then came the call about the awards dinner. Callum called on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, his voice carrying a practiced carefulness I recognized immediately, the tone he used whenever he was delivering a message that wasn't entirely his own idea. "Grandma," he said, "I wanted to give you a heads up about the Concours Awards dinner next month. Breyer and I think it might be simpler if it's just the two of us attending. It's a huge platform for her following, and we want the moment to feel focused on the car's current story." I set down the wrench I'd been cleaning slowly. "Callum," I said carefully, "your grandfather spent 30 years on that car before either of you ever touched it. What exactly does focused mean in this context?" "It's not about excluding you," he said. "We just want the dinner to feel uncomplicated for this particular moment." "I see," I said. "And has the dinner's own program even mentioned your grandfather's name or the car's actual history at all? Or is that also part of what needs to feel uncomplicated?" There was a brief pause. "It's mostly focused on our own restoration journey right now. We can address the history stuff separately if it comes up. And you don't think 30 years of your grandfather's own work is relevant information for an awards dinner honoring exactly this kind of restoration?" He didn't have a ready answer for that. I didn't argue with him further in that moment. I told him I understood, thanked him for the heads up, and hung up the phone. I stood in my own garage for a long time afterward, understanding with a clarity that arrived all at once exactly what I was going to do, though I decided to wait to see how the concours event itself, held the following weekend, unfolded before making any final decision. The concours was held at a sprawling regional fairground, rows of gleaming classic cars arranged under a bright afternoon sun, hundreds of attendees, including serious collectors, event judges, and enthusiast journalists who'd come specifically to cover the show's featured entries. I arrived early, helping arrange the display placard for Emmett's own car out of habit as much as love, the same instinct I'd brought to every one of his own show appearances decades earlier. For the first hour, the afternoon was in fact lovely. I spoke with several longtime collectors who remembered Emmett fondly from decades of regional shows, genuinely curious about the restoration's continued history, and with one of the event judges, a careful man named Harold Pruitt, who asked, almost as an aside, how the car had actually come to Callum's attention. I answered honestly, mentioning the direct family connection in plain, factual terms, and watched Briar's attention flicker toward us from across the display area without quite approaching. For a little while, I let myself believe the whole afternoon might simply pass without incident. That evening, at the Concours Awards dinner held in the fairground's own banquet hall, Breyer accepted a Restoration Excellence Award on the couple's behalf, giving warm remarks to the assembled crowd about the incredible journey of finding this car rotting in a barn and bringing it back to life entirely through their own patient work. She gestured toward projected images of the car throughout, never once mentioning its actual 30-year history, its true origin, or the man whose decades of careful labor had made any of tonight's recognition possible at all. The room applauded warmly. I sat near the back of the banquet hall, listening to my husband's entire life's work reduced to a footnote in someone else's barn-find story. I stood up slowly from my seat. The room quieted the way a room quiets when it senses something is about to happen that it hasn't fully decided how to feel about yet. Since we're celebrating a restoration tonight, I said, my voice calmer than I expected it to be, I'd like to add something to that story, since it seems to have gone missing somewhere along the way. My husband Emmett bought that car in nearly unsalvageable condition the year we married, and spent 30 years bringing it back himself, one careful decision at a time, long before either of tonight's speakers ever touched a single bolt on it. I paused, letting that land fully before continuing. To that car, I said, that's about to go home with a person who actually still holds its title. The silence that followed was the kind you could have poured into a glass and served alongside the dinner wine. Callum's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, confusion first, then something closer to dawning understanding. Briar's smile didn't fall so much as it simply stopped existing, replaced by something rigid and pale. "Rosalind," she said quietly, "what are you talking about?" Near the head table, I saw Harold Pruitt quietly set down his own glass, his expression carrying the particular stillness of someone doing rapid calculations about an award he was reconsidering in real time. I didn't answer the confused murmurs that followed. I stood, gathered my coat, and walked directly out to the fairgrounds parking area where the car itself was still displayed under the evening lights, its title, as it always had been, entirely in my own name. I arranged the following morning for a flatbed to collect it and bring it home to my own garage. I drove myself home that evening with the windows down, the cool evening air moving through the car, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not rage, something quieter and colder than that. Clarity. Somewhere along that dark road, I thought about every Saturday evening Emmett and I had spent together in that garage, decades before either of us imagined his own life's work would end up credited as someone else's lucky barn find. I thought, too, about the years after Emmett died, learning to manage every part of our own household alone, the insurance, the taxes, the small decisions he'd once handled without complaint. Widowhood had taught me, whether I wanted the lesson or not, that I was considerably more capable than anyone, including myself at times, had given me credit for. I felt that old, hard-won capability rising back up in me now, and I understood with total clarity exactly what I was going to do before I even reached my own driveway. I called my old friend Delphine before I called anyone else, a woman I taught alongside for nearly 3 decades at the same high school, needing to hear a voice that understood exactly how thoroughly someone's actual life's work could be quietly reassigned by people who claim to admire it. I told her the whole story, 2 years of incidents, the toast, the flatbed arranged for the next morning. She listened without interrupting, her own tea going cold in front of her. "Rosalind," she finally said, "you spent 40 years making sure students understood that a story's actual source matters, that you can't simply borrow someone else's labor and call it your own discovery. I don't think that principle stops applying just because the person forgetting it happens to be family. I keep waiting to feel guilty about what I did tonight," I told her, "and it isn't coming." "Maybe it isn't coming," Delphine said, "because there's nothing here to feel guilty about. You didn't cause a scene. You simply refused to let a lie about your own husband's work stand uncorrected in front of an entire room. Those are very different things, no matter how anyone else wants to frame it." I called Deborah that same evening as well, needing to hear a voice that would tell me the truth rather than simply agree with me. I told her the whole story, 2 years of incidents leading up to it, the toast, my own response. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Mom," she finally said, "you've been letting yourself get smaller for 2 years so Breyer can feel bigger about a story that was never actually true. That's not generosity anymore. That's just a slow kind of disappearing." "I know," I said. "I think I've known it for a while." "So what happens next? Are you actually going to revoke the loan agreement permanently, or is this still just something you're considering?" "I already know exactly what I'm going to do," I told her. "I just needed to talk it through with someone first." That same evening, I called my attorney, Marguerite Aldis, who had drafted the original loan agreement and understood exactly what protection I'd built into it 2 years earlier. I explained the pattern plainly: 2 years of quiet erasure, the awards dinner, the deliberate exclusion from any honest account of the car's history. "Let me pull up the actual document while we talk, Rosalind," she said. "The termination language is specific here. Repeated public misrepresentation of the vehicle's provenance and restoration history, sufficient grounds to terminate with immediate effect, given that you retained full title throughout. Recovering the vehicle yourself was entirely within your rights the moment that condition was met tonight, in front of a room full of witnesses, which makes this about as clean a recovery case as I've seen in years of drafting these agreements." I sat with that fact for a long moment, understanding finally exactly why I'd insisted on that condition in the first place. Those first few days after the dinner were harder than I expected. I found myself more than once reaching for the phone to call Marguerite and tell her to hold off, that surely there was some gentler way to make my point without keeping the car permanently. I stood in my own garage one entire evening, running my hand along the car's own fender, trying to remind myself exactly what I was protecting before I let the decision go any further. Each time, I made myself sit with the discomfort a little longer instead of acting on it, remembering Delphine's words, remembering the actual weight of the phrase, "a barn find we brought back to life," remembering that gentler corrections had already had 2 years to work and hadn't. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do because I think it matters. I did not simply take the car out of spite. Marguerite drafted a formal professional letter confirming the loan agreement's termination, citing the specific documented misrepresentations by date, the magazine profile, the car club gathering, the social media caption, the concours program, each one referenced plainly and confirming my sole legal title and right to possession going forward. I sent that letter through her office with no personal note attached beyond what the letter itself required, the same plain, unremarkable language that could have applied to any bailment dispute between any two parties anywhere in the state. Callum called the following morning, his voice tight with confusion and hurt. "Grandma, why did you actually take the car? We could have talked about the dinner without you removing it entirely. I understand it feels sudden," I said calmly. But Breyer built an entire public identity around a restoration your grandfather spent 30 years earning credit for, then spent 2 years watching that history get quietly rewritten as your own lucky find, right up until I learned I wasn't even properly acknowledged at the one event honoring his actual life's work. I'm simply asking for that car to only be represented the way it was actually restored. There has to be another way to handle this that doesn't feel like losing something Grandpa built for our family, too. There is, I said. The car keeps being shown, and the credit finally gets told accurately, starting immediately, and I'm properly consulted about every public appearance going forward. Or it stays in my own garage, which I'm entitled to decide. I'm not interested in punishing you for Breyer's choices. I'm interested in finally being an honest part of how your grandfather's story gets told. Breyer called 2 days later, her voice sharp. Rosalind, this is completely disproportionate. You're punishing us over how we frame social media captions. No, I said quietly. I'm the woman who watched you spend 2 years quietly erasing where that entire restoration came from, right up until you turned my husband's 30 years of work into a footnote at an awards dinner organized specifically to showcase your own barn-find story. I think the real question is what you thought would happen once I finally understood exactly how thoroughly that history was being erased. Every restoration story needs a compelling hook. That's not a crime. It isn't, I agreed. But that car was never meant to fund a compelling hook in general. It was meant to carry a specific real history. Those are different things, Briar, and I think some part of you has always understood the difference, which is exactly why you kept softening the details every time someone asked directly. She hung up on me. I sat with the dial tone for a long moment, then went out to my own garage, understanding that whatever came next would take time to settle. The weeks that followed were difficult ones. Callum called nearly every day at first, caught between his wife's hurt feelings and a growing understanding of exactly what had actually happened. Harold Pruitt, the Concours judge who had attended the dinner, called Callum directly to ask whether the toast he'd witnessed had actually been about his own grandmother, since word had traveled through the small regional car community about a title dispute. Callum told me later that admitting the full truth to Harold out loud for the first time outside our immediate family had been strangely clarifying. Harold just said, I noticed Rosalind seemed quiet all night at that dinner. Now I understand why, Callum told me. I think I'd spent so long not letting myself notice it either that hearing someone else name it finally made it real. Deborah, once she heard the whole story, offered to sit down with Callum directly, walking him through the full timeline the way only a family member who'd grown up watching Emmett work on that car could recognize clearly. She told me later that she'd laid out the whole sequence for him at her own kitchen table, using the same organized precision she brought to reviewing a hospital's operational reports. Every incident dated and specific, watching her nephew's face change as the pattern finally became undeniable. I don't think he understood how systematic it actually was until he saw it laid out chronologically, Deborah told me. He kept saying, I thought that was just one weird comment at one car club meeting. It wasn't one comment, Aunt Deborah. It was 2 years of them. About a week after the letter went out, Callum asked if I'd be willing to join a video call with him and Breyer together, something he described, a little awkwardly, as trying to get everyone on the same page. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity about what that page might actually contain. When the call connected, Callum was sitting at their kitchen island, Breyer beside him, her expression carefully arranged into something between contrition and defensiveness. Grandma, Callum began, we wanted to talk through everything as a family, figure out what happens next. I'm listening, I said. Breyer spoke first, her voice tighter than I'd heard it before. I think we all said things in the heat of the moment. I know the toast landed wrong, but taking the car with no warning beyond what was legally required felt like it was designed to hurt Callum's connection to his own grandfather's legacy as much as possible. Was that the intention? I considered the question honestly before answering. The intention was to stop watching Emmett's actual legacy disappear a little more every month. If it hurt, I understand that. It should. 2 years of quiet erasure doesn't undo itself painlessly just because the reason it's ending is a fair one. I could lose my entire following if this story gets out publicly, Breyer said, her composure cracking slightly. Is that really what you wanted? What I wanted, I said, was to stop being described as a family project while Emmett's actual 30 years of work funded your entire public identity. I never once asked you to build a following. You couldn't tell, honestly. I only asked eventually, and apparently not clearly enough, to be treated as an honest part of it. Callum was quiet for a long moment, and then he turned slightly toward Briar, away from the camera, in a way that suggested he'd forgotten briefly that I could still see them both. "She's right," he said to her, quietly but clearly enough for me to hear. "We built an entire narrative around something that wasn't ours to simplify, and I let it happen because correcting it kept feeling like more trouble than it was worth." Briar's eyes filled, and for the first time in the entire call, she didn't have a rebuttal ready. "I don't know how to fix a story that was built partly on someone else's silence," she said, almost to herself. "You start by no longer needing it to be a story at all," I told her. "Just an accurate description, plain as any title document in that car's own glove compartment." "I'd like that," Callum said. "I've been waiting 2 years to hear it said plainly." The call ended a few minutes later, quieter than it began. About 3 weeks after the letter, Callum came to see me alone, sitting across from me in my own garage. "Mom told me everything," he said, "the whole timeline laid out chronologically. I don't think I understood how systematic it actually was until I saw it that way. I think I let myself believe it was harmless because correcting Briar kept feeling like more effort than it was worth." He paused, running his hand along the car's own fender. "I keep thinking about the Saturdays I used to spend out here with Grandpa before Dad died," he said, "handing him tools, just like you always did. I don't know when I started forgetting how much of that patience actually belonged to him specifically." "Thank you for saying that now," I told him. "Why didn't you say something sooner, before it went on for 2 years?" "Because I kept telling myself it wasn't really about credit," I said. "It was never about credit, Callum. It was about accuracy, about whether your grandfather's actual life's work survived being used or quietly disappeared the moment it stopped being convenient to mention. Can I ask you something? Why did you let it go on for so long? You corrected people yourself early on. Why not every time after that?" "Because I kept believing the next occasion would finally be the one where the truth simply won out on its own," I admitted. "And because, if I'm honest, some part of me was afraid that correcting it too often would make me seem like a difficult grandmother rather than a supportive one. It took losing an entire evening honoring your grandfather to understand how backward that priority actually was." Briar came to see me on her own several weeks later, considerably more subdued than our phone call had been, sitting stiffly across from me at my own kitchen table. "I keep thinking about how close I came to actually losing my entire following over this," she admitted, before we'd even gotten to the harder parts of the conversation. "I know I have complicated feelings about how this happened, Rosalind, but some part of this fear was just about genuinely believing I'd built something meaningful of my own. That's allowed to be true at the same time as everything else, right?" "Of course it is," I told her gently. "I never wanted you to lose what you'd built. I only ever wanted my own husband's part in that story acknowledged honestly." She nodded, wiping her eyes, and continued. "I've been thinking about everything," she admitted, "about how easily the story became mine to control instead of something I was simply lucky enough to help continue. I think I was scared, honestly, that a restoration with a story that impressive would somehow make my own presence in Callum's life feel smaller by comparison, like I hadn't earned my own place in this family yet. You were never meant to compete with it, Briar," I told her. "You were meant to help carry it forward, honestly. Those are very different things." "I don't know how to undo 2 years of telling it wrong," she said. "You don't undo it," I told her. "You start telling it accurately, starting now, every single time it comes up, and let the story going forward finally be honest." "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Why did you keep giving me the benefit of the doubt for so long, even after that first magazine article, even after your own correction got laughed off at that car club gathering?" "Because I wanted so badly for you to be exactly who Callum needed after losing his own father so young," I admitted. "It's a very particular kind of hope, watching a grandson build a life with someone, hoping she'll turn out to be everything he needs her to be. I think I let that hope talk me out of trusting my own instincts for longer than I should have. We talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon, about Emmett, about the garage, about what that restoration had actually been built to carry." I showed her Emmett's original restoration logs for the first time, 30 years of careful handwritten notes about parts sourced, problems solved, decisions made and reconsidered. Breyer read through them slowly, her hands careful, before asking if she could have copies made for their own records, properly labeled this time. By the end of that conversation, something between us had shifted, not fully repaired, but genuinely, honestly begun. Callum and Breyer saw a counselor together that autumn, at Breyer's own insistence, something that had never happened in 4 years of marriage before that year. Breyer told me later that the counselor had asked them, in an early session, to describe the single biggest unspoken assumption underlying their shared public identity. We both said the car, almost at the same time, Breyer said. Neither of us had ever said out loud how much of what we called our restoration journey actually depended on 30 years of work that wasn't ours to claim as a recent discovery. I called Marguerite a few weeks after the letter went out to update her on how everything had actually unfolded, since the family reconciliation had moved faster than either of us expected. "Rosalind, I've drafted a lot of these loan agreements over the years," she said, "and I can tell you what you did wasn't reckless. It was actually one of the more disciplined uses of a bailment recovery I've seen a client execute in 20 years of practice." I told her I hadn't thought of it in those terms, that it had felt in the moment more like an act of pure grief than discipline. "Sometimes the two aren't as far apart as people assume," she said. "You built that protection because you understood decades ago exactly how easily a restoration story can slip away from its rightful history. The fact that you eventually needed it doesn't make you any less careful for having built it in the first place." Deborah flew in for Thanksgiving that year, the first time in years that both of my remaining children and grandchildren had gathered under one roof at once. My own dining room filled with the smell of a roast and the sound of easy conversation that hadn't existed at any family gathering in longer than I cared to admit. Callum and Breyer drove over with a pie Breyer had made herself. No professional styling, no staged photographs, just a slightly uneven crust she laughed about setting down on my counter. Over dinner, Deborah's own husband asked, innocently enough, how the whole car situation had eventually settled, clearly having heard only fragments of the story secondhand. The table went quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that used to precede something painful in this family, before Breyer simply said, "Emmett spent 30 years restoring that car, and I spent nearly 2 years letting a cleaner barn find story replace that history because the truth felt like it made my own presence in this family look less impressive somehow. She finally made me prove I could actually earn being part of that story honestly." Nobody laughed uncomfortably. Nobody needed the subject changed. Breyer called her own mother that same autumn, correcting at last the story she'd repeated so warmly at that holiday gathering months earlier. Callum told me she'd come off the phone looking wrung out, describing her mother's reaction as a long, uncomfortable silence followed by a quiet admission that she'd always privately wondered why a restoration that impressive had seemed to happen so quickly after they got together. She sent me a brief note not long after, considerably more restrained than Callum's or Breyer's own, but genuine in its own careful way, thanking me for correcting a picture of the family's history she'd simply accepted without ever asking directly. A few weeks after that Thanksgiving, a card arrived in my mailbox, Callum's familiar handwriting on the envelope. Inside, he'd written only a few lines. "Grandma, I keep thinking about all the months I let Breyer's version of the restoration become the only version anyone heard. I can't undo that, but I can promise to correct the record every time it comes up again, out loud, without waiting for you to have to do it yourself. Thank you for finally showing all of us what Grandpa's actual work was worth." Tucked inside the same envelope was a smaller note in Breyer's own handwriting, brief and considerably more humble than anything she'd ever said to me directly. "Rosalind, I spent 2 years building a public identity around a restoration that was never mine alone to claim. I'm sorry it took losing the car for me to understand that." I folded both notes carefully and placed them in a small drawer where I kept a photograph of Emmett standing proudly beside that car on the day of its very first show appearance decades earlier, grinning at whoever was behind the camera. I think he would have recognized exactly what those notes meant, and I think he would have been quietly satisfied that the record eventually corrected itself. The car's provenance documentation was corrected within the month. A new placard prepared describing its full 30-year history, Emmett properly credited by name at every future show appearance. Breyer requested a new feature with the same Regional Enthusiast magazine that had run the original Barn Find story, this time providing the car's complete honest history for their materials. The publication, mildly surprised by a couple actively requesting a more complicated story than the one they'd already printed, agreed to run a corrected profile the following season, one that finally credited 30 years of patient restoration work rather than framing the car as a recent lucky discovery. Harold Pruitt, notably, reached out to Callum directly that winter, having heard through the small regional car community that the vehicle's history had finally been disclosed honestly, and expressed renewed interest in nominating the car for a legitimate Heritage Recognition Award, one specifically honoring long-term restoration projects rather than recent discoveries. I told him I appreciated the honesty this time around, Callum told me. He said that was actually the whole reason he was willing to reconsider the nomination at all. The car received that Heritage Award the following spring, a small brass plaque now mounted permanently on the display stand, listing Emmett's name as the original restorer alongside the exact years the work had taken. 30 years finally rendered in careful permanent lettering. 3 months after the letter, once that honest history had genuinely taken root in how the family spoke about it, I reinstated the loan agreement under identical terms, requiring nothing further beyond what had always been agreed. Callum hugged me for a long time when I told him. I promise, he said, every single interview from now on starts with the real story. I saw Delphine again that spring, over coffee at the same small cafe where we'd talked through everything the week after the dinner. I told her about the reconciliation, the corrected placard, the honest feature. Delphine listened with the same quiet satisfaction she'd shown from the very beginning. I told you it would matter, holding that line, she said. Most people don't have the nerve to actually do it, even when they know they should. You did, and look what it actually bought you. Not just the car back, the truth back. I thought about that phrase for days afterward, the truth back, understanding that it described exactly what I'd been missing more than any award ever could have. Do you regret any of it? Delphine asked gently, the 2 years of silence before you finally acted. I regret the silence, I told her. I don't regret loaning the car freely, or the family, or even the patience I gave before finally reaching my limit. I think I needed all of it, in some strange way, to finally understand exactly what I was protecting when I insisted on that clause 2 years ago. I think about that phone call about the awards dinner often, the wrench still resting in my own hand, my grandson's careful voice explaining why my presence would complicate a clean story. At the moment, it felt like the end of something. Looking back now, I understand it was actually the beginning of something else entirely, a family finally required to reckon honestly with the legacy it had been quietly editing. I don't regret loaning that car freely. Callum's happiness mattered to me, and it still does. What I regret is how long I allowed my own husband's 30 years of patient work to be quietly rewritten before I finally insisted the record reflect reality. Real legacy was never meant to require its own history's erasure as the price of being properly appreciated, and I intend to make sure every story I'm actually part of survives being told accurately from now on. I think, too, about all the years I spent believing that quiet generosity was itself a kind of grace, that a good grandmother simply handed over whatever her family needed without ever asking the story to acknowledge the true cost. I no longer believe that. Giving without acknowledgement isn't grace. It's simply a slower, quieter kind of erosion, and it costs exactly as much in the end, whether you name it out loud or not. The difference is only in how long you wait to stop paying for it. I think about the specific moments now with a clarity I didn't have while I was living inside them. The magazine profile crediting their discovery. The enthusiast told a story about sourcing that never happened. The concours program's single generic phrase standing in for 30 years of careful work. Each one seemed small enough to excuse in isolation. Strung together, they formed something considerably less innocent, a pattern deliberate enough that I no longer believe, looking back, that any of it was entirely accidental. Breyer may not have consciously planned each individual omission. But the cumulative effect served a purpose she understood on some level, even if she never named it to herself, keeping Emmett's real history small enough that the story could remain entirely, conveniently hers to tell. Real generosity, I've come to believe, doesn't require secrecy to survive, and it certainly doesn't require humiliation as its price of admission. If a family needs you to disappear quietly into the background of your own husband's legacy in order to feel comfortable with their own narrative, the discomfort is telling you something important, and it deserves to be listened to, not smoothed over with another vague toast. I think of it now the way I used to think about a bolt left slightly under-torqued in an otherwise careful restoration. You can leave it that way for a while if you want to. It never once corrects itself on its own. It only continues quietly, working its way looser until someone finally takes the time to check it properly. I think sometimes about all those years handing Emmett tools in that cold garage, learning that every honest restoration depends on respecting exactly what a thing actually needs before you ever claim credit for what it eventually becomes. It took me 75 years and one very public toast at a concours awards dinner to apply that same standard to my own family. I loaned that car freely, and I would loan it freely again. But I no longer accept a version of legacy that erases its own origin. If I am the reason a restoration survives to be shown again, I intend to remain visibly part of that restoration story, not because I need applause, but because pretending otherwise was never generosity. It was only ever a kindness to someone else's more convenient narrative, purchased at the cost of my own husband's memory. The car appeared at its next regional show quietly the following spring. Family and close friends only in the immediate group, no press fanfare, no rehearsed toast designed to impress anyone watching. Simple folding chairs, and the car finally displayed exactly the way it always should have been. Breyer gave a short, genuinely humble statement to the small crowd that afternoon, thanking the judges, thanking Callum for his own growing restoration knowledge, and then, without any hesitation or vague qualifier, thanking Emmett specifically for 30 years of work that made any of today's recognition possible at all. She said his name clearly, his actual contribution stated plainly, no vague phrase standing in for the truth. Deborah flew in specially for the occasion, standing near the back of the small crowd with genuine warmth on her face. Delphine attended as my guest, finally getting to see the car properly credited the way it was always meant to be understood. I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for 2 years. I am 75 years old, a widow, a retired teacher, a grandmother who still shows up for the people she loves whenever she's needed. But I am no longer a woman who quietly loans out her husband's life's work while watching its true origin get replaced by something more convenient. That particular version of me stayed behind in that brightly lit banquet hall, along with an unfinished glass of wine and a toast about a barn find that nobody in that room will ever quite forget. I drove home that night as one woman, and I woke up the next morning as another, and I have never once wished myself back into the first one. Sometimes people ask me if I'd do anything differently if given the chance to go back to the day Callum first asked to show the car, knowing everything I know now. I tell them the truth, I would loan that car again every single time because Callum's happiness was never the mistake. The mistake was assuming a good restoration would naturally protect its own history, that 30 years of patient work could survive on its own weight without anyone occasionally insisting the actual restorer be acknowledged. If I could change one thing, it wouldn't be the loan I made. It would be the 2 years of small corrections I let slide, corrections I mistook again and again for graciousness rather than what they actually were, a slow and quiet surrender of my own husband's memory. Deborah's own children ask me sometimes, whenever they visit my garage, to tell them the whole story of how that car actually came back to life, the estate auction, the ruined engine, 30 years of patient Saturday evenings. I tell it every single time exactly the same way, unhurried and complete, watching them absorb a history that finally belongs to everyone who actually helped build it. No detail softened, no name left out, exactly the way it should have been told from the very beginning. These days, when anyone asks about the car parked in that garage, they hear the whole story, the estate auction, the ruined engine, 30 years of a marriage folded into every careful decision it took to bring it back. I'm simply finally exactly as present in that history as I always should have been.